Hello, welcome back. It's December and it is pretty cold. I hope you're surviving as the winter is seeping into our bones. Trying to get out for a chunky walk before all of the light disappears. Today, we have a conversation with Dr. Lawrence Foweather, who is from Liverpool John Moores University, and he's also behind the Physical Literacy Consensus Statement for England, which, if you haven't read it, is really worth a read. Kind of music to our ears, in that it's not talking about fitness, it's talking about this sort of concept of physical literacy and our lifelong understanding or association with movement, our lifelong relationship, that's the word I was searching for, with movement. I've linked to it at the end. He also represents the IPLA, the International Physical Literacy Association, who have got a fantastic infographic on physical literacy. So if you haven't heard of the term physical literacy, this is a very good place to start. Listen to this, and at the end, we've put in some links for you to do a bit more reading. But yeah, it's a really interesting episode. Let's get cracking.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, so my guest today is Dr. Lawrence Foweather, and I've wanted to get Lawrence on for a while. Lawrence has contributed to a lot of interesting conversation, a lot of interesting papers on the concept of physical literacy. So it's really something I wanted to talk about, and I'd like to do a series on it because I think it's such a powerful concept, and I think it'll be interesting to a lot of our listeners. So, Lawrence, thanks so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it. And just going to ask you the question I always do, which is, who are you and how'd you get here?
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Dr. Lawrence Foweather. I'm a researcher and lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University. I guess have been researching children and young people's physical activity for about 20 years. Um, my PhD looked at the effect of after school clubs on children's kind of health, well-being, fitness, physical activity, um, obesity, and motor competence. And then I guess from that, really, I've always been interested in how can we support children and people to be more active. Um, and through that, really, I've done lots of different research projects in school-based settings, in community settings, kind of working both in terms of sport, but also kind of whole school physical activity. I've also done some work in early years, and I've also done some work on specific groups, for example, females and girls and adolescent girls as well at the same time, really. So my research is all about trying to help people to be more active. And yeah, the focus has mainly been on children and young people, but I do have an interest in the life course really as well, and just getting people more active generally, I guess.
Okay, well, that's pretty good background. I was going to ask you about some of your previous work, but I think that gives the audience a good idea of what they can expect from the conversation. So, like I said, the reason I wanted to have you on is because I think you've been really instrumental in promoting this idea of physical literacy, especially in the UK. Your work with Sport England and Liverpool John Moores. So, I think if we're going to talk about that, we kind of need to talk about this idea of physical literacy. So, what is physical literacy, and could you provide a bit of a background on the concept and its history?
Sure. Yeah. So physical literacy is not a new term. It's been around actually since the 1800s, believe it or not. It's a long time. Um, but the prominence of physical literacy really came about through the work of, in more recent times, through the work of Margaret Whitehead. So kind of back in the turn of the century, around about 2001, really, she kind of launched this idea around physical literacy really as a physical education specialist professor, um, in response to what she perceived as a growing crisis around kind of children and people's health and well-being, around inactivity, around increasing obesity levels. And her perception was that in the context of PE, um, it wasn't really inclusive. It was mainly aimed at the more elite or competitive kind of students, and so she tried to advocate for a concept that was more around for all abilities and more around kind of helping people to become more active through their learning in the curriculum, really. So Margaret's work kind of grew in popularity as people kind of grasped hold of it, really, I guess. And she herself kind of evolved her thinking around physical literacy from the early 2000s onwards. Um, and then as a result of the popularity growing, really, lots of different countries and organizations started to adopt her definition of physical literacy. And it kind of grew into an international, global concept, really. Um, and because of these different countries adopting it, different organizations, sometimes they adopted their own unique definitions or interpretations of physical literacy, which were sometimes similar to Margaret's, sometimes a little bit different. And I guess really that led to certain countries, if you like, feeling like they needed to get some consensus around what physical literacy was in their country. So the first country to have a consensus statement was Canada back in 2015, and they adopted Margaret and the organisation she founded, the International Physical Literacy Association, their definition of physical literacy, which is basically to have the motivation, confidence, physical competence, and knowledge and understanding to value and take responsibility for movement and physical activity throughout life. So they adopted that definition. There was additional consensus statement work. So in 2019, I think it was, Australia, they also set up a consensus statement process involving some academics from Australia, leading institutes, and they kind of had a slightly different definition, I would say, really, where they basically conceive the concept as being about your the holistic learning that you get through movement. Um, and then since then, we've had additional consensus statements from uh, Ireland and Northern Ireland, and their consensus is a similar definition to the IPLA, to Margaret's definition, really. And more recently, we've had the work in England, the consensus statement here, which was in 2023. So I think the concept has basically become um, internationally recognised as important. It is mentioned in the World Health Organization Global Action Plan for Physical Activity as a key outcome for promotion. It's mentioned in UNESCO as a key outcome for high quality physical education. So the kind of global recognition now for the concept and the term, really, and that was born out of Margaret's early work. And I guess really now what we see is different countries have adopted their own definitions to reflect their kind of culture and language, and the importance of movement in their context.
I think that's a really good background and history. Um, so for our audience members who just listen to this, they say, okay, there's some really good things. I'm hearing different ideas that resonate with me, in terms of, making movement meaningful, sense of, confidence, emotional connection to movement, all these different ideas. But in your words, if I was going to ask you, classic elevator statement, I ask you, what do you do? You say, well, I work on physical literacy. How would you explain it to a layperson, just in a sort of a casual, off the cuff way?
So I think for me, if I was talking about physical literacy, I'd talk about it being about in a very casual, off the cuff way, about living your best life through movement. Is probably my most casual way of saying it, really. But in essence, it's about um, having positive movement experiences that make you want to be active again and again and again. Really, is my interpretation of it. Really, so um, some people might restrict it down to being around the capabilities to be active. Some people might restrict it to the holistic development that you get through being active. But for me personally, it's more around kind of that positive engagement, which therefore leads on to that generating meaning, value, enjoyment to want to be active again and again. Really, that intrinsic driver for movement.
That makes a lot of sense. So regarding physical literacy, why is it a useful concept? Why is it important that different countries define it? Why is it important that we have consensus statements on it? What what other concepts are floating around there that it's important to have physical literacy as a guiding principle?
So I think that the beauty of it really as a concept is that it's actually universal in the sense that it applies across different sectors, right? So, although Margaret's work, born out of her work in physical education, actually physical literacy as an outcome has got relevance for any movement based context. So, whether that be sport or whether it be coaching or whether it be health and a health practitioner or even active transport or the environment or so on, really it's got relevance across all those sectors. So I think that the the main positive is that kind of it spans multiple sectors. It also is relevant for both policy and practitioner levels. And I think the other thing about it is, and sometimes like people maybe might perceive it as not necessarily always being new. And that's because actually what it does as a concept is bring together all the best bits of multiple concepts in one place, really. So it really is kind of a holistic concept in terms of um, an outcome, but also it provides a framework for in terms of how we might promote physical activity and how we might guide decision making, collaboration, investment, and also how we might design, facilitate and deliver positive movement experiences. So, yeah, there's the physical literacy, the outcome, and the outcome in Margaret's work would have been around that you would have a disposition to be active, you'd be inclined to move, you choose to move if you like, really. Um, so there's the outcome, but then also there's the approach. Physical literacy is an approach, really, and that's the framework that kind of really mixes in lots of different concepts together. Um, with a view to kind of promoting positive experiences.
Yeah, I know that's sort of been one of the debates in the literature and in the sphere, talking about the difference between the process and the outcome. And I think, looking at the outcome, I think that that's a really nice way of explaining it, just giving people the opportunities to have, a positive relationship with movement throughout their entire lives, and what opportunities can we provide for people so that they can feel like they have that positive relationship with movement. Because I think, and you'll know this as well, if you talk to anybody, not even older people, across all genders, there are some people who growing up, I think maybe because of the way physical education was provided in the past or something, there are a lot of people who are quite like traumatized from their memories of PE classes, or sometimes they'll have these narratives and say, "Oh, I don't like moving," or "I'm not a mover," or "I don't like using my body," and things like that. And that always seems to me, a tremendous tragedy, especially if it's a belief that came out of trying to promote physical activity.
Yeah, sure, this is why it's not just about a movement opportunity, right? It's what happens in that space, in that time, in that place, with those people around you, really. So that experience is central, is critical to whether you're going to want to do something again. I agree with you. It's really sad that people's perceptions of were that negative that they had many moments and many negative experiences really that left them with a bad taste in their mouth around movement and physical activity that they didn't want to do it anymore, essentially, really. So I think this is probably like a bit of a difference between physical literacy and physical activity, and part of the work we've done in England has been probably to try and clarify that in a bit more detail, really, in terms of differentiating what does promoting physical activity look like and versus what does promoting physical literacy look like, really. And they will have overlap and they'll be similar, but I guess a lot of the messaging around physical activity has been around moving more, but not necessarily around the quality of that movement experience. And I think it's the quality of the movement experience that will ultimately influence whether you're going to want to do something again or not. So, for some people, if they're moving, they might be moving on a treadmill and absolutely hating that experience, right? So, what is that going to make them stick to it? Are they going to maintain that behavior? For other people, they might love running on a treadmill, and that might work for them, and they might get some enjoyment or meaning value out of them. And for those people, that will sustain them. So, part of the thing that physical literacy teaches around is that we're all unique, we're all individual, so we've all had different experiences, both good and bad, in movement context and otherwise, really, and that will shape how we perceive movement going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I kind of have a love-hate relationship with exercise, and I grew up as someone who wasn't very physically active in the grand scheme of things. I was all right, but my brother was, he's so good at football, soccer, he's so good at all these sports, and he kind of he really stood out as just like this fantastic athlete. So even though I was fine at everything, I think I spent a lot of time doing non physical things just because I sort of felt I was relatively better and I kind of had more space there. So the gym was great for me in my 20s because it was a nice opportunity for me to use my body and kind of figure out how to use my body and express strength and physicality and all these things. So I do see the importance of the gym for some people. But then, when I was working as a personal trainer, I was working as a CrossFit coach. It took me a while to realize that some people just it does not resonate with them. The idea of spending time in a gym under the lights, using machines, it's completely anathema to them, and they just want to be outside, moving in other ways. So I think, yeah, it's a very good point that it's horses for courses. Different things work for different people. Um, what you were saying, about this physical literacy being a concept that can sort of bridge the gap between policy and practitioners. I think that's a really important point because I think so often, if you're in the space and you're sort of a practitioner or someone who provides, I'm going to say, physical activity opportunities for people, sometimes you do sort of feel this disconnect. So it is nice having a word that is sort of imbued with all this meaning of like essentially how can we I guess generate these positive movement opportunities and these experiences for people. And I think that's why it really resonated with me when I first heard it. It just really clicked, and it really resonates with other people. I think when you explain this idea of physical literacy to people, um, it's like you said, it just clicks with people, and it makes sense in a really nice holistic way.
Yeah, I think that, um, because it's relevant across the life course, we can all think about this personally, about what this means to ourselves, and actually, that making it personal. So, going with the personal before the professional helps people to really get behind the concept because they start to understand, actually, when I was moving most and when I was moving well and feeling good. So when I was thriving through movement, what was I doing, and why did movement matter to me at that time, really? And what was it about movement that mattered to me then? And if you reflect on your own journey, your own movement experiences, you start to join the dots. You start to see, oh, actually, that was because, um, I had a group of people around me that I really loved spending time with, and we had a great social connection playing soccer or football or any other kind of team sport at that time, and it was great. Develop great friendships, but also strong relationships through the process. So it might be that reason. Um, and that'll change as you go through your life course, really, in terms of your different life stages and what it was interesting in hearing your story, really, because ultimately, yeah, for some of those people, the gym setting might not be the setting that gives them meaning, value, enjoyment, really. It might not be the intrinsic driver, and it might be actually the extrinsic driver that's getting them there in the first place, right? They might wanna look good, but not necessarily for internal reasons, for societal reasons, really, if you like. So they wanna go to the gym for that reason. It might be that they've got a friend who's dragging them there every week, and they don't really wanna be there, but that's why they're there. Um, but those people are going to be more likely to drop out, really. And that's why I talk about this as being a relevant concept across different sectors, because even in elite sport, even for the elite athlete, every morning they're going to need to get up early, train hard, um, for their competition, for their elite sport. And they're going to need to want to do that, right? So even at the elite level, you need to build meaning, value, and enjoyment into their experiences because otherwise they're not going to want to train hard. They're not going to want to be at the best. They're not going to thrive. So um, it's got the same relevance really from a physio to a health professional to a medical doctor. To it has to a sports coach or a PE teacher or any other professional really in a movement context. It should be really important. And it kind of shifts the question from, well, it's an additional question, if you like, really, from not just asking you how active you are, but also, what matters to you about movement and why, that kind of question.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You mentioned a few things I want to pick up on because I think that they're really interesting. Um, First thing I want to talk about because I think it is an important concept is this idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And obviously, if you're in the field a lot, it's something you talk about a lot. But I think sometimes if people aren't used to thinking about it, I think it's worth talking about that and maybe talking about the process of how you can take extrinsic motivators or extrinsically motivated behavior and how you can try or what's the process of making things intrinsically motivating. So that's my first question. I'll follow up the other one in a second.
So a good theory to look at for this is self-determination theory, and it talks about the motivational kind of continuum really for that. Um, I'm not an expert in that theory, but I'll kind of like, but I think from my perspective, I guess really intrinsic motivation is obviously the purest motivation, and that actually is kind of fun, enjoyment, happiness, those kind of drivers really. But you can also have positive forms of extrinsic motivation. So if it's kind of if you're doing it for the value it brings to yourself, for example, it might be that you value the health gains or you value the mental health benefits from that activity. Those kind of things really, those more integrated motivations, then that would also be positive too. Um, Whereas if you're doing it for rewards or kind of extrinsic motives such as that, really, that's going to have more negative connotations too, as well at the same time. And I think from a self-determination motivation theory perspective, that more control motivation types is what basically will discourage participation going forwards. And what we're trying to promote is more autonomous motivation going forwards, really. And that's what I think. Like ultimately, with physical literacy, what we're trying to do is develop people's autonomy, right, and give them agency, give them the agency to actually to want to move and to find movement and to enjoy movement and thrive through movement, and that's kind of the goal, really. So a lot of my work, although is children and people focused, because I'm a big believer in prevention and that kind of early intervention kind of age group, really. Um, those concepts are really important throughout your life in terms of what's your why for movement and why you're doing what you're doing, really.
Yeah, agency is a concept we talk a lot about in our classes at Wild Strong. In fact, we start every class with a why, sort of talking about what our why is for doing this and, how it might be useful for you. And it's one of the things I found, for years working as a personal trainer and CrossFit coach, so much of that traditional structure, I think especially in the gym, it doesn't necessarily rob people of agency, but it doesn't always provide them opportunities to build their agency. A lot of times you just feel like your personal trainer is sort of prescribing these arcane movements for you. You don't really understand why. You're sort of using these machines. You don't really see what the connection is. And I think it's so often, while people fall off because it's never other than it being something you're supposed to do, your doctor says you're supposed to do, um, you know, eh, we don't always do a great job of connecting this to people's deeper inner whys. I think that agency is so important, and obviously, if you can tie it into activities or hobbies or interactions that are meaningful to people, which is why I do like a capabilities approach. I think applying a capabilities approach just you show people you can kind of maximize their options and allows them to participate in all these different things that are meaningful to them. The other point I want to pick up on, which I think is important, I think it's worth talking about, is physical literacy as it relates to the life course and different life stages. Because, and I know that I think you recently made a change to one of the graphics in the consensus statement a few weeks ago as well. I remember you talking about it on LinkedIn, kind of changing the way you talked about the life course in a good way. So I think we should spend some time sort of talking about this life course aspect of physical literacy. And if you can kind of take me on a journey of different ways we can apply physical literacy from young children to teenagers to adults into later adult life, I think we can get some good examples of how this idea of physical literacy is applicable to people's lives.
Yeah, sure. I think if I use the framework of the physical literacy consent statement as a guide through this kind of narrative, I guess, really in terms of uh, in the visual infographic we have for that, we've got kind of the blue triangle at the top, and that's kind of the meaning value enjoyment piece, really. So if you think about meaning and value enjoyment across a life course, I've got two young children, right? So what do they find meaningful, value, and what do they value and enjoy about movement and physical activity, right? And it's jumping in muddy puddles, it's throwing sand at the face in the face of each other, that kind of, it's not about sport and traditional kind of activity formats, really. But you know, me personally, as a young person, as a child, young person, I did a lot of kind of sport and activity. I played a lot of soccer, did a lot of structured team sports and so on, really. So, and you can see through that kind of late childhood, adolescent period, there might be a lot of people getting into structured sport, community sport. Some of those people and children and people might go on to kind of more elite pathways. Some of them might just generally participate. And then you kind of get to that period in the mid-adolescence point where you might start to see some drop off. So maybe people, are not necessarily enjoying the competitive aspects, and maybe people have found other interests in that age group that they might want to pursue rather than movement and sport kind of activity context. So music or spending time with friends or relationships or whatever it is, right? So there's transitions there about what people might find meaningful and value and enjoy, and equally as an adult, what I enjoy about movement might shift. So I guess for me personally now, things like taking the dog for a walk and kind of going to a nice green space or walking on the beach is probably something that I find quite meaningful because it might give me a break from kind of the academic workload and the headspace and a bit of breathing space really. So you can see how from a meaning, value, enjoyment lens, what you value and enjoy will change throughout your life really based on your own particular interests and preferences as you go forward really. But if I take the second part of the visual infographic that we have in England, it's about the capabilities part, which is move, connect, think, and feel really, and that kind of holistic development part. So um, and within that, move, connect, think, and feel is basically physical, social, cognitive, and affective development. So physical competence, motivation, confidence, knowledge, understanding is all in there. So is things like building relationships and so on, really. And you can see how, from an early years perspective, actually, like we need to provide holistic movement experiences. But at that very young age, often we'll prioritize things like movement skills and fundamentals, if you like, really, because they're kind of building that throughout their journey. And I guess kind of as you progress, really, you want them to build in confidence and kind of master different movement forms and explore different environments, right? And then in children and adolescents, as those skills hopefully are more mastered, but we know that's not always the case. Um, and those capabilities will kind of shift really, and then participation might drop off at different life stages. So there's different transitions. So there's a transition from primary school to secondary school, or high school, as you might call it. There's a transition from high school to college or university, and that might see a drop off because maybe a young person's moved to a different location and their existing sporting infrastructure is gone. They don't have the same access to clubs or teams there that they have at their university. And then kind of you become, a grown up, an adult really, and working life kind of hits you really, and your priorities might change in that sense. And that's where you might, because of work pressures, because of potentially starting a family and parental and childcare pressures as well, you might have less time for movement activity, and that might influence your engagement. And then what does that mean for your capabilities? Well, if you're not engaging, it might have an impact on how motivated you feel. It might have an impact on how confident you feel about moving because you haven't done it for a long time all of a sudden. And you've lost a few of those kind of connections and relationships that you had there that were kind of a bit of a motivation before. Um, so it becomes a bit more difficult. I think the other thing about adult life is, especially, we might be relatively active into young adulthood. And when I say young adulthood, I probably mean up to about 35. Um, But then those kind of life incidents kind of kick in, those moments. But also the big factor that we know is actually injury is a big factor too. So, people suddenly start having all sorts of different injuries, knee injuries, ankle injuries, back injuries. And that can also have a big impact on people. And sometimes that might mean they might need to change their preferred activity to a different activity because they can no longer do the thing they really love and enjoy and value the most. So that's kind of where people have some big transitions really. And then I guess as you get a bit older in terms of like different transitions and stages, um, there's obviously a big transition from going into retirement, depending on people's employment. So, did they have a job that was more manual kind of labor work or was it more desk based? And how does that influence their change in their activity levels into retirement? Um, and equally again, we know with older adults, a big part of it is about maintaining their physical competence, if you like, really, because um, we know about kind of muscle loss and kind of bone density and all those kind of issues is really if you go through that period. And therefore, because of that injury, because of that kind of physical decline, that can also impact on their confidence and their motivation, and that'll have an impact going forward, really. So again, they might choose different activities and change their preferences based on their strengths and their needs and what they can do around that time, really. Um, yeah, so I think we all have different experiences, right? And so throughout our life, our lived experience will be different, and that difference will be influenced by our own characteristics. Where we live, our demographics, so our education level, our employment, our ethnicity, or our disability status, or all those different factors really will play a part, because we know there's kind of systemic and structural barriers to activity itself. Um, and we know that it's not a level playing field. So therefore, people are going to have very different journeys. Um, but even if you're someone who probably is a bit more fortunate in terms of those circumstances, things like injury or things like negative experiences can still get in the way in terms of that journey and that path that you might have, and your relationship through movement will change throughout your life course, really. So I think from an older adult's perspective, um, these concepts, the concept around finding meaning, value, enjoyment, is just as relevant. The concept about looking at your own capabilities, how you're moving, connecting, thinking, and feeling in movement activity is still as relevant at that age group as it is in children and people in early years, and even pregnancy, kind of that going that far back, really. Um, so yeah, so I think although a lot of the work in physical literacy has been done in children and people, it's certainly got relevance in older adults, and hopefully, as the research field evolves, as practice evolves, we will capture more evidence and learn and insight from those older age groups as we go forward.
That was a really excellent answer. You kind of covered a lot of questions I wanted to ask. So well done on that. Um, yeah, the idea in physical literacy, in the consensus statement, let me make sure I get this right. Move, connect, think, feel. Did I get all of them?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I love I love that way of thinking about it, because one of the things we always try to do is, we borrow from a lot of Seligman's work. So he's got the PERMA model of what it means for people to flourish, and essentially it breaks down to the same things: having meaningful relationships, feeling like you have a sense of progress, feeling like you're getting something better, feeling like you're attached to something bigger, and just to embed the move, connect, think, feel into a consensus statement is great, because I think it just sort of provides like a guiding light for people if they want to think about how to either design an intervention, if you want to think about it as top down, or really how you can kind of co-create these different communities, or just ways for people to move. That's really one of my favorite parts in the consensus statement. It's funny what you're saying about life course, because I am 41 now, and up until 39, I was just like, I just thought I was absolutely killing it. I'm like, I'm doing great. I'm running, I'm weightlifting. I look good for my age relatively. I had young kids, so that took a bit of a dip, and I just felt like, oh man, this aging thing is completely mental. It's a social construct. It's fine. I'm going to be doing this stuff. And then I hit 40, and I ruptured two discs in my lumbar spine, and then I ruptured my distal bicep. Like 6 months apart, just doing normal stuff I would have done, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, I need to take this seriously now, because my recovery is different. I just can't engage in certain activities the same way I used to. And for me, I took a bit of a hit, because these were things that were so meaningful to me, and they were a big part of my life in my 20s, my 30s, and then all of a sudden, really realizing I had to change it. And luckily, as you were alluding to, I kind of had the emotional support. I had a nice community around me, so I was able to find other ways to keep on engaging with it. But you see how just one thing, it's very easy to fall off the horse. Definitely. Um, I mean, you said a lot in the last comment.
I mean, it'd be good to go into movie connect, think, and feel a bit more detail if you don't mind. Right. So I think I guess probably like um, in the England consensus statement, and it's a bit similar to the Australia consensus statement in a way, in the consensus statement, our expert panel um, basically thought that it was better to go with domains of activity and movement than it was to identify specific elements. So when I say specific elements, I mean things like motivation and confidence and resilience and balance, or those individual kind of skills and competencies. So be it domain level, so move is the physical domain, connect is the social domain, think is the cognitive domain, and then social is the connect is the social domain. So that kind of is about holistic development. But within that, you might have multiple different skills and competencies and capabilities that are important for helping people to have a positive relationship with movement. And that those capabilities will look different for different people. So what one person needs to have a positive and meaningful relationship might be different to another person. So it's kind of meant to be very inclusive and non-exhaustive by having these domains, because ultimately the skills and competencies could be different for different people. Okay. So I think that's probably like those capabilities will depend on each person's strengths and needs and life stage, and ultimately, um, developing those competencies and skills will hopefully help people to build autonomy and agency. But the other way that we move, that actually more frequently move, connect, think, and feel is being used by the sector is actually more of a way of reflection and looking back. So after an activity, how did you move? Did it feel challenging? Did it feel skill building or frustrating? How did you connect with others, with the space or with movement? What did you think? Did you learn something, or maybe did you understand the activity better? And how did you feel? Did you feel energized or happy or bored or and so on really? So you can use it as a tool to reflect back and look at the quality of someone's movement experience, not just what happened, but how it was received. But you can also use it in terms of the capabilities to be active in that kind of more holistic development perspective. Um, these are the things we need to support someone to have a positive relationship with movement, and then if they have that positive relationship, that will then go on to hopefully mean they're more active, and if they're more active, that will then enrich their lives, and they'll get holistic development from the different forms of activity they engage in as well at the same time. So yeah, so I think that it's a useful lens for both designing um, movement experiences, so making sure you've got an experience that is providing an opportunity for physical, social, emotional, cognitive development, but also you're using that as a lens of looking at people's strengths and needs. So, how do they move? How do they connect? How do they think? How do they feel? On an individual level, but also on a group level, because you might need that information to design your sessions. But then you can use it on a participant level to get them to reflect back and think about, how they've made progress, what they did well, where they want to improve on in terms of those particular aspects and contributors. But I think that the key part of that is that these things are all interdependent; they're all related. So, like one of the things that in physical literacy is widely agreed is about, um, and this is kind of comes from Margaret's thinking around monism and so on, really. But mind and body connected as well, really. So all these things, although it's helpful for us from a designing and facilitating movement experience perspective to break them down, really these things are all connected, right? You can't separate out. Um, for example, your confidence is based on your own thoughts and reflections and beliefs about your own abilities, right? So there's a think and a feel domain connected there straight away, and that'll be based on your actual competence, full competence, so on. So all these things are interconnected and interrelated, really, and it's important to be aware of that. You can't really isolate them and focus only on one.
I think your point about the importance of reflection, especially when we're talking about participants, is really really big because the way we change those narratives that people have, the stories about themselves, that reflection, it can be so helpful, especially if you're working with populations of people who they're not going to write down their whatever their squat one rep max or things like that. If you're wired that way and you've got your little spreadsheet and you're writing it, you can see progress one way, but that process of reflection and making it meaningful and building it back in, I think is so important. So I think that's a really good point. while we're talking about the consensus statement, I'd like to go ahead and just talk about it a little bit more because it is just a really, it's a really great piece, and we alluded to the some of the graphics and tables earlier, and we'll share those in the links along with the full statement. But could you just kind of tell me a little bit about the process, the genesis of building up this consensus statement, and then some of the big takeaways you got out of it, what you hope will come out of it? I'd just like to, draw our audience's attention to it and kind of see how it's being used.
I'll tell you about how it came about as well, really, because I, around 2016, 2017, 18, 19, we had a couple of brilliant PhD students, Hannah Goss and Cara Shearer, and they basically looked at physical literacy assessments. So at that point in my academic career, I was the director of studies. Really, I was interested in how we assess physical literacy. Um, because at the time I felt that was important because we needed to do more interventions, more initiatives to try and improve physical literacy, really. But what we learned through that work really was that unless there was some agreement around what physical literacy is, it's really hard to define what should be in an assessment, what you should be assessing, if you like, really. Um, and so we basically had a conversation with Sport England, who are the national sport organisation, NGO in England, about the assessment work we did, and talked about the issues that are brought, and talked about how there's different definitions now, and we think we need some kind of consensus in England, really, and had that conversation with them. And fortunately, they were happy to commission some work, some consensus based work, really, and I think that was in view of the fact that they recognise. Even in our evidence review as part of that project, we found 23 different definitions of physical literacy, right, in the academic and grey literature. And then if you think about the different elements that I talked about before, like motivation and confidence, those different definitions had over 50 different elements in there. So you can see how people were getting quite confused. You can see how people didn't really know which way to turn. And what that meant is basically that practitioner pressure was just froze and just didn't go in any direction with it, really. So Sport England thankfully viewed the consent statement as something that was important to develop a shared understanding, to unite perspectives in England on it, really, I guess, and then also with a goal really to catalyse and enhancing the uptake of physical literacy at scale, really. So it's really difficult to advocate for a concept if everyone thinks it means something different at that time. So that was where the work was born out of, and then part of the work there was different phases. The first part of the work was in a learn and insight phase. So we did evidence reviews where we looked at different definitions, we looked at different elements or constructs involved in those definitions. We looked at what was the agreement in the literature around key principles, and we also looked at the evidence for the benefits of physical literacy at that point in time as well. We did some other work, because this was funded out of Sport England's Children and People's Directorate, where we did some work with children and people themselves, some focus groups, where we spoke to them about what they find meaningful about movement and activity, and we also asked them about what they think they need in terms of capabilities to be active for life. So we got their perceptions and their voice in there as well. And then we also did some stakeholder engagement work where we did a national consultation survey where we asked um, anyone with an interest, really, and that ranged from kind of coaches, teachers, health professionals, tell us what they thought physical literacy was and why it was important, and and what their interpretation of the concept was, really. Um, and so that work really highlighted the fact that there was a demand. So actually the sector did want clarity. They did want a shared understanding. There was also confusion, because of the number of different definitions and so on, really, and that led to the consensus statement work, really. And then the actual statement itself was co-designed, um, or co-developed by a group of 60 expert panel members, and that included 30 kind of academics or researchers, and they were kind of across different disciplines. So you kind of would have physical activity people, you'd have pedagogy people, you'd have kind of more kind of physiology or psychology or biomechanics, or the whole host of different kind of range of academic expertise, play, and so on. And then we also had professionals in there, and they were kind of like system leaders or mid-level kind of senior people in organizations that I guess really were across different sectors, but also they were capable of scaling up this in the future, really. Um, so in kind of consensus statement work, that's quite a big panel. It's very large compared to some other panels, really. So that was brilliant because we have very much diversity of voice, and if you want something to work across sectors, then you need to engage and co-create with all those different voices around the table. It also meant that we kind of created something that was a shared language that could then be upscaled across those sectors as well at the same time. Um, but one of the feedback we got from the stakeholder consultation was around people who thought that physical literacy was too academic a concept, and they were getting bogged down in all the different kind of philosophy, and I think the phrase was academic snobbery around the language and so on. Um, and so one of the goals of the consensus statement we had, which I think we're quite unique in that sense, was we wanted it to be really accessible in terms of language and really, really clear. And so we wanted to use we wanted the statement to be able to be understood by the non-expert, the non-specialist. It could be a parent who could pick it up and understand exactly what it means, really, for example. So one of the goals was to keep the language kind of really clear. So kind of, it's keep it as simple as possible, but no simpler kind of Einstein kind of philosophy behind it, I guess, really. Um, so yeah, hence language like move, connect, think, and feel being born out of that, really. So yeah, so the expert panel co-created it. They wrote the statement. And that kind of was really powerful because by the end of that process, we had around 50 different organizations involved, and then they became kind of an army of physical literacy advocates. And they kind of rolled out the consensus statement within their own organizations and in their sectors and kind of grew from there, really. But so I think that the process was just as powerful as the actual product in terms of the statement itself, in terms of the way in which it was developed and the people around the table and the different voices, and it being a consensus statement by everyone. This wasn't Sport England's consensus statement. This was very much developed um, by the sector for the sector, if you like.
That's that's good background, and I like the point you made about trying to avoid the academic snobbery because it is, as I've said before, it is something that feels applicable and meaningful. One of the questions that I asked in the notes, I was asking about finding this balance between clinical concepts and real life provision or practice, and actually how do we go out and get people moving in meaningful ways. And you mentioned these Thrive principles, which I hadn't heard of before. I was wondering if you could talk about them in that context.
Sure, yeah. So the physical literacy consensus statement for England is very much kind of like, what is physical literacy? Why is it important? It's kind of a shared understanding of the topic itself, really, but it doesn't really go into detail about how you can promote physical literacy, and how you translate this concept into practice, policy and practice, really. So since the consensus statement, we've been doing some work with Sport England and partners and colleagues, really, where we basically tried to come up with some action orientated principles that you could use to apply physical literacy into kind of policy and practice. And so we developed Thrive, and Thrive basically, and you'll see through Thrive, some of this resonates with the content of the statement, really. Thrive stands for tailored, holistic, reflective, inclusive, varied, and empowering. So if I go through each of those ones, tailored is kind of just about um, being person centered in your approach, really. So, that every individual wants their experiences and movements are designed around what they enjoy, what matters to them, their strengths, needs, and circumstances. So, being person centered is critical to physical literacy. And we talk about the individual being at the heart of physical literacy. That's the T there. It's tailored there. Um, so we might use move, connect, think, and feel, for example, as a way of a framework to understand someone's strengths, needs, and so on. We might ask them about their preferences, all that kind of thing, really, and build it around that. The H is for holistic, and that reflects the kind of design and movement experiences that do support move, connect, think, and feel, physical, social, cognitive, and affective development in and through sport, activity, and movement. The R, and I like the fact you like this, Andrew, was for reflective. So But that is about reflection, thinking about how you're developing, what you enjoy, what feels important to me, and what I want to do next. Ultimately, so people can help make choices about what they want to do in terms of being active in the future. And that's about people designing opportunities for their participants to reflect, right? But equally, I guess from a practitioner, you could also reflect as well. And then the I is for inclusive, and inclusive is about partially about equity of opportunity, so that there are opportunities to join in, no matter your age or gender or ethnicity or disability or health or whatever it is, or how much money you've got. But also, it's also about the experience within a movement context. So actually, that sense of belonging, feeling connected, feeling safe, feeling welcome and supported, the being inclusive once you're in the movement environment as well. And then the V is for varied. So people having different opportunities to explore different ways of moving. So that might be different places and spaces, green spaces, blue spaces, different kind of topographies, um, different climates and terrains, those kind of things really, but also different levels of challenge, structured versus unstructured, individual versus team. Um, just basically exploring different ways of moving really in different environments and different levels of challenge. So ultimately, people can keep interested and keep engaging and keep being motivated. And the last one is E for empowering. And empowering is all about that voice and choice, and ownership, really giving people a chance to take control, if you like, of their own movement journeys and helping to foster that love of movement really going forward. So yeah, Thrive is our way, and you can view that as a practitioner in terms of how you design a session. So is it tailored? Is it holistic? Is it reflect? Does it have opportunities for reflection? Is it inclusive? Does it have varied movement opportunities? Is it empowering in terms of the activities and the facilitation? But you can also look at that from a policy or system perspective too, really, in terms of you know, is my curriculum kind of holistic and the policy design and those kind of things really as well at the same time. Is are we reducing inequalities in terms of our opportunity and those kind of things really as well?
You must have felt pretty good when you came up with the acronym because it's A, a really cool acronym, and like B, there's no wasted things. Sometimes you look through the acronym and you get down to like whatever the V or something, and like you run out of actually good pertinent words. But this is a good one. It's a tight and very helpful acronym. And again, I think anyone who's ever been a practitioner, working at different levels, you can see how all these are really helpful both for design and co-creation. Um, so I'd like to talk about maybe some specific projects that you've been a part of, actually thinking about, applying these things and actions. And the one that I know you've been talking about recently on social media that I thought sounded very interesting is you were helping out with some work through Active World. Is that right?
Yes, yes, it was. Yeah, so that was an interesting project, really. I guess I'm not an expert in kind of adults or old adults really in terms of their movement and physical activity, but I was supporting this project with my kind of expertise in kind of co-creation and co-design and using something called the behavior change wheel, which is kind of a framework that you can use to develop interventions. So um, Active U is basically a project on the Wirral that had a goal. It was commissioned by a public health team there to essentially to kind of reduce falls. Um, and the interesting thing about that project is the age group. It was basically around falls prevention. So the age group was kind of 40 to 65. Um, which obviously is a 45-year-old myself personally. I'm like, right, this is really it does dawn on you when you feel yourself hitting those boundaries, those age boundaries. Um, and it was a really interesting piece of work because of the focus on prevention. So I mean, often in falls prevention or falls risk work, it might talk about someone who's had a fall in the past year, or someone who's worried about falling, or someone who's got an unsteady gait, for example, and they might be at risk of falling, or someone maybe who's on medication, and that might be causing some issues that might mean they might fall in the future, and so on. But this was very much about primary prevention and trying to get in there before it happened, really. So it was a different conversation to a lot of the other work I think that's gone on around falls and in older age groups, 65 plus. But um, the nice guidelines that we have in England now, they go from 50 over, but again, they're more about people at risk of falling. So quite unique in that sense, and so um, Active Wirral, who are the local authority kind of leisure and activity kind of wellbeing services, they kind of brought together a group of different stakeholders and partners to help them to co-develop the intervention, and we kind of went through the behaviour change wheel process to do that really, um, which basically involves different stages. Like you kind of identify what it is that you're exactly trying to change. So what's the type of behaviour? Then you kind of look at the influences on that behaviour, and you do kind of a what we call a combi analysis. So you look at the barriers and facilitators in terms of capability, opportunity, motivation towards that behavior. Um, and then based on those findings, you kind of choose which particular barriers to target and you design an intervention around that using the behavior change wheel steps really. Um, so I think what was interesting about that work was probably um, some of this we touched on before about life stages and what can impact on really, but you kind of, first of all, there was a bit of confusion out there. People didn't really know what counts as balanced activities. People didn't always know, or they mostly knew about what counts as strengths activities, but they weren't necessarily doing them. Um, but what was interesting for me in terms of falls risk as a learning point for me individually was probably actually like so we've got some kind of world-leading biomechanists in my department in the Research Institute for Exercise Sciences, and they talk about how balance is really critical for falls risk, and so yes, lower leg muscle strength is very important too, but balance is actually really important. It's the thing that probably actually no one really is really focused on doing. So I think for me, like it's great to see that strength has had growing recognition around its importance over recent years. There's a bit of a cool culture around lifting now and resistance
Yep.
training that's
Yep.
apparent now. I don't know if you see that for balance, right? Apart from things like maybe yoga and more mindfulness kind of activities, if you like, I'm not sure we see that cultural coolness around balance activity
Yeah.
and promoting that. So I think for me, that was a learning point really around. It's almost like a forgotten kind of competency, really, that we need to probably nurture a bit more and it throughout that kind of life period, rather than just thinking about it when we become at risk because we've got an unsteady gait, kind of something that we need to maintain and progress really, and it being more in our consciousness alongside strength rather than kind of being a bit forgotten about really as well at the same time. So that was interesting. And then I think people still had this kind of perception around the 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 residents that responded to us and we spoke to talked about how there was still a perception around fear of judgment, not being comfortable in kind of more gym-based settings really because of the fact there was either a lot of young people there or actually interesting because of the fact there was all older people there. So it's in this kind of midlife group, they felt like there was nothing for them and that nothing of relevance for their age group, if you like, really. And it was either for the sporty or the young or the really old, and therefore they're not in that category. So, and that's why it was interesting as well because one of the key learnings was around, don't talk about falls to this age group because I just don't think it's relevant for them really. Like, unless they have got an issue with gait or they have fallen, it's not on their radar and it's not something that's going to motivate them to do any activity or movement. So you kind of need to shift the narrative and focus on the balance and strength aspects and talk about it in terms of boosting energy levels or feeling better about yourself and all those kind of more positive frame messages, um, than you do compared to saying you might fall in later life really as well at the same time. So it was a very interesting project to work on, and it's always good to kind of get again. It's similar to the consensus statement really. If you can bring lots of diverse voices from different kind of sectors together in a room, you end up with something quite um, powerful in terms of the conversations. And what I love about those forums that you create through the co-design sessions is that there's often spin-off conversations that occur and something else starts happening outside of that particular project or thing you're working on really, um, and people often talk about feeling more invested in their work and more likely to enjoy the piece of work through these processes. So um, So yeah, so we've got a framework now for different work streams for Active You that Active Wirral are going to try and push forward with. So um, around trying to promote strength and balance activities to that population, but also around trying to help and support professionals to have more conversations with people about strength and balance activities. So actually, there's been a bit of a movement to encourage professionals to have conversations around physical activity and moving more, but this is like an added level to that. So actually, can you talk about strength and can you talk about balance as well as this general movement kind of based question, really? Because I think that's important to pick up. So yeah, it was an interesting project to work on.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said, and I've noticed the same thing. That age group, as you get into that middle age, the mid 40s, before you get into your mid late 60s, you do feel like that group sometimes falls through the cracks because you do see these provisions for older adults, whether it's chair yoga or balance clinic and thing like that. And what you said about the stigma of fall training, you're right. It's something that is seen as for older adults, but as we know, prevention is so important. We want to maintain all these capabilities, while we're still young, and whether it's bone density, lower body, leg strength, avoiding osteoporosis, avoiding sarcopenia, all that. Um, but even in working with older adults, I found that, just saying fall training, you can see that people tighten up in a way because it's sort of like this negative thing. They become, sort of hyper vigilant about it. Whereas if you talk about building dynamic balance and reaction and, you do it in, a sort of game form, then, people really put a lot more into it. It's much more meaningful. I'm glad you mentioned ComB. We do a lot of stuff with behavior change wheel with our students, and, we always talk about why it's useful, but it's really great to hear researchers and practitioners to give an example. So I can take this podcast and give it to our students because it is such a helpful model when you're trying to make sense of a behavior and looking at what all the opportunities and everything are. We're getting close to the end of the interview now, so what I'd really like to do is just kind of talk about what you're going to be working on in the future, and what kind of has you optimistic about things. So, really, yeah, two questions. What changes have you seen in the various fields you've been a part of in the last 20 years that have you feeling optimistic, like things are going in the right direction in terms of conversations people are having? And then, more specifically, what are some projects you're going to be working on in the future that people can keep their eyes open for?
Well, good questions. I guess I'll talk about my field, which is physical activity. Really, I think that Um, two things really. I think one big shift is around the move towards kind of more place-based approaches or system-based approaches. Kind of recognizing the importance of relationships and connections between kind of individuals and organizations and kind of this kind of shared ways of working and reducing duplication. I think that a more multi-sectoral kind of work, and if you like, really is going to be quite powerful. So, and ultimately, kind of working with the assets at place level and what's strong rather than what's not, what's wrong. I think that's a big shift, really. And so a lot of it has moved away from an intervention to more sustainable kind of more holistic kind of work, if you like, really more um, strategic, high level work, I guess, really in that sense, really, and making sure that things are based on that kind of community need, really, and kind of working around that. So I think that's really positive. And then obviously, I'm going to talk about physical literacy as being something I view as being positive, but I think there's starting to be a bit more of a shift in physical activity around recognizing the importance of affect and the effective nature of movement experience, really. So I think probably maybe if you go like late 90s through the 2000s, probably there was a lot of work around minutes of movement and connecting that to different health outcomes, which is great, and it's kind of what the guidelines are based on in terms of how many minutes of activity or what intensity we need to do to reach these health benefits. And that's really important. But there's also an increasing recognition now around the quality of the experience being important too, really. And even when it comes to different outcomes, the quality of the experience might affect those outcomes differently as well. So not all minutes are equal in that sense, really. So I think that's a big shift that's occurring. Um, the more recognition of kind of social and effective kind of processes and the importance of those in terms of maintain and sustain activity throughout lives. And then I guess from me, from a project's perspective, I'm 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 kind of still really invested in physical literacy as a topic, really. So a lot of my work now is around looking at the different ways it's been implemented and trying to capture those, because now we need to try and share learning and help people and support people to try and implement this at scale and in practice. So a lot of my work's around that, really. So I think there's work to do there. Um, and I think, Thrive is something I mentioned on this podcast, and Thrive is something we've not really evaluated yet. So I'd be great. I'd love to kind of to do a research study where we tried to pilot Thrive and did some evaluation around that, which could be looking at more process based evaluation work in terms of how has that changed the perceptions of the at the system level of practitioners and professionals. Really, what are they almost auditing whether they're, because they might not be calling it Thrive and they might not be calling it person centered, but they might be doing some of these things right. It might be holistic. They might not be using moving, connect, think, and feel. So almost like a bit of an audit about what is the current provision, the quality of it, if you like, really, and then actually, if you did adopt more of a Thrive based approach, what would be the impact on the positive and meaningful relationship with movement? Because ultimately, Thrive is about trying to support people to have a positive, meaningful relationship with movement, and that's the thing we need to capture. Um, so yeah, which brings it all back round to assessment in some ways, right? So you need to try and capture these things really as well at the same time. So I think in our work in England, because we define physical literacy as being about your relationship with movement, it's very difficult to quantify someone's relationship with movement, right? It's from pregnancy throughout to their life. It's ever changing, it's complex, it's evolving. There's lots of different moments that have happened. So, can we really quantify that? Maybe qualitatively, we could do that. We could try and capture people's life stories, for example, and capture a bit and dig into that really. Um, it's difficult to capture quantitatively, I think, but you can still capture indicators of that. So, we can quantitatively assess people's enjoyment of movement. We can ask people around if they find movement matters to them or if it's important to them. We can also assess what we would think about as being foundations for physical literacy, which is move, connect, think, and feel. We can assess physical capability and social competencies and so on as indicators of our physical literacy. But I think it's important to be aware about, yeah, if we define it as relationship, what is possible to assess and what's not really. And I think part of the usefulness of us being really clear on a core definition of physical literacy in the England work is that it brings a bit more clarity to that assessment question. Before in physical literacy, there's a lot of debate around can you assess it, can't you assess it, and if you think about the IPLA and Margaret's definition, including motivation and confidence and physical competence and knowledge, you think those things are all accessible, right? They're things you can assess as constructs. So you can see why people are getting confused about the debate. Whereas I guess what Margaret was also speaking about was this disposition to be active, and that's the bit that you can't really assess because how do you capture that part of it? So having a relationship definition is hopefully bringing a bit of clarity to the assessment goals and purposes and what's probably possible and what's not.
I think that's really interesting what you're saying about the, actually thinking about the effective aspects to it. And then, like you're saying with the qualitative evaluation, it's interesting. Any practitioner or provisioner, they know the importance of collecting the quantified data, and the importance of showing, well, look, we did this, this, and this. Um, but in some ways, we have a lot of the information now. We know physical activity is good. We know exercise is good, but that's what interests me as well is, how do we kind of take all the qualitative aspects of this implementation and, create, really look at the fidelity to make sure if we take this here, how can we co-create something that is equally effective in another community. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that's the direction that there's so much promise in there. And what you said as well about not all minutes are equal. That's really interesting because I remember when I was doing my personal training test years ago, and my eyes would just glaze over when I had to memorize, okay, 130 minutes of this at this intensity, and X minutes of this at this intensity, and I had to calculate METs and all this stuff, and it just never resonated with me in a way. And I understand why it's useful, and I think it's very good to have those guidelines. But at the same time, I think you're exactly right. Looking at the quality of those minutes we spend moving, I think that's going to be so much more meaningful for people. So, well, Dr. Lawrence Foweather, thanks so much for your time. I got a lot out of this, and I think the audience is really going to enjoy it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Day, night. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
And we're back. Thank you so much to Lawrence for coming on and bringing on the conversation about physical literacy. Sort of really liked that he kept bringing it back to people's actual lives and the quality of their movement experience rather than just the numbers. We actually have Gillian Barsall, who also works in physical literacy, coming on in the beginning of January. So this will be a nice one to start with. Again, I've put those links in the bottom in the show notes, so have a look at those, and there's some further reading as well. Next up, we have Lorraine Close joining us to talk about trauma-informed movement and working in community settings and how difficult that is now that there's just very, very little funding around. It's a really good conversation about the challenges of really running anything at community level and trying to offer it for free and make it meaningful for people, because there's just very little support. So we'll be back with that. You have a good week. We'll be back soon.